Today's video is a follow-up to several other videos I did on stress eating. I gave a series of strategies to deal with stress eating that I called the lines of defense. First line of defense is things that you do with yourself to stay centered, right? So things that you do for self-care to make sure that you don't get so stressed out that your only recourse is to just sit on the couch and eat. Step two is things that you do in community for self-care. So that might be calling a friend, it might be meeting somebody for happy hour, it might be taking a walk with a friend. Line of defense three is something that you do with a professional. So that might mean getting a massage or working with a weight loss coach or working with a therapist, something like that. Those are the three lines of defense to try and keep you centered, healthy, emotionally feeling well. Today's video is for you if you've watched those other videos or you've listened to me talk about that and you're like, yeah, I do all those things. And still I have this insatiable desire for food. Or maybe it's not a constant desire for food, but maybe you just have these bouts where you just can't stop eating. Or maybe you walk into a room and or you go to a party and the brightness of that party or the brightness of the room resides in whether there's food there. The food creates the brightness for you, and the only brightness. If that's what you're experiencing, then the lines of defenses, although they are helpful, that's not really getting to the root of the issue. What I'm going to talk about, I'll just say, I don't want to move beyond my scope, but I'm going to speak from personal experience on this one. When I experienced food in that way in my life, where that was the bright spot of my life, what was true for me is that was a symptom of trauma that I had experienced. Because I had experienced unresolved trauma, I had taken all of the emotions that I was feeling, that stuckness of the trauma I'd experienced, all of that I was feeding with food. So rather than resolve the trauma, I was simply feeding it, trying to feed my sorrows or drown my sorrows with food, as it were. I think I've shared before, I grew up in an abusive home. I had an abusive parent. As a kid and as a teenager and in my early 20s, you grow up in an environment like that, because that's all you don't know there's anything wrong, so you cope as best as you can, right? And so I coped by eating. I think I've shared in another video that I wouldn't have identified myself as an emotional eater because that didn't show up for me in this linear one-for-one, I'm sad, I'm gonna eat some chocolate ice cream. It more showed up as this, anytime there was food around, I would just perk up. My idea of relaxing was sitting down and eating not a serving of something, but the whole bag of something. And so that's why it was very tricky for me to identify, because it was so ingrained. It was very much a part of my life. So it was just how I lived. I just had this desire for food and I didn't know what to do about it. The answer, of course, is we need to resolve that trauma. Again, I'm just gonna say I'm not a therapist. I know a great therapist if you'd like to work with one, but I'm not a therapist. That's beyond my scope. If you know that you have experienced some kind of trauma and you need help with that, I highly recommend finding a therapist to help work through that. What I can speak to is how I used my relationship with food to work through my own trauma. The first step is simply to identify that. Keep in mind that when we use that word trauma, we think it's this really big, full-blown thing, like living through a war or something like that. But it's important to realize that trauma pain is a very personal thing. So if you've experienced something as trauma, it doesn't matter how it compares to anybody else. It's you that you have interpreted that way, you are living it in that way, and so that means it's yours to work through. So I think that's the first thing, is keep in mind that maybe you're listening to me and you're like, well, I didn't grow up in an abusive home. I had a perfectly happy home. I have no excuse for feeling the way I do about this. Don't let that blind you. to the fact that you might still have trauma in your experience. So that could mean going through a global pandemic. Maybe you lost your job and under stay-at-home orders, and that is, that's an economic trauma, right? That's a medical trauma. We're all afraid of getting this sickness. There's a whole world of examples of trauma that we might say like, well, I don't have it that bad. But again, if it's causing you stress, and it's causing you stress that's beyond your regular scope, your regular coping mechanism, then that counts as trauma, and that could be causing you to attach to food in the way that you have, and to use food as a coping mechanism. What do we do with this? Let's say you've identified this, you're like, okay, yes, I know I've experienced some kind of trauma, and I need to work through it, but I don't know what to do about it. So again, working with a professional is highly recommended. That's good. And in the meantime, while you're trying to find that professional, let me share what I did. So the way that I worked through my own trauma was whatever the pain was around food. So for me, there was this pain around binge eating, right? Where I would sit down and for whatever reason, I didn't just want some, I wanted all. And it just turned into this thing where I'd be full and I would still be putting the hand to mouth and I couldn't stop it. So what I wanted to do was just ignore that. But what I did instead was turn towards that. So the practice that I used is something that's called felt sense. And there's actually a book called Felt Sense where I got this from. I forgot the author's name, but it's felt, F-E-L-T, and sense, S-E-N-S-E. And in that book, the author describes what felt sense is. We as humans, we experience emotions as feelings in our body. So somewhere between our chin and our hips. And that has to do with just physiologically where the vagus nerve moves through our body. And I won't get into that. But the point is, you feel emotions from your chin to your hips. So somewhere in between there. And a great example of this is, let's say you've gotten angry at someone, like truly angry at somebody or something. My question for you is, where do you feel that in your body? If you say you feel it in your head, then you're actually disconnected from your emotions, because again, emotions only happen between chin and hips. So maybe next time you're feeling angry or you're feeling a clear emotion, pause and just notice, where does it show up as a feeling in your body? I can tell you in my body, when I'm feeling angry, it usually happens in my stomach, like my stomach clenches into a knot. The practice of felt sense is when you experience an emotion, rather than trying to think through it or ignore it or do anything like that, you actually turn your attention to that sensation in your body and you sit with it. You just sit with it with your attention on it, and you wait for something, some thought, something to come up for you, some imagery. And there are some people, and this is kind of the premise of the book, is that there are some people who actually, they think through things more on an emotional level like that. I know that I tend to do this. Sometimes my brain, I might not think of something, but I will feel a feeling in my body first. And so the key for me is to always turn towards that feeling and focus on that. And then if I can focus on it, then usually coherent thoughts will follow that actually give voice to what it is that I'm feeling. That practice I applied that practice to my eating. So anytime that I was feeling something other than physiological hunger, but I was wanting food. So physiological hunger shows up as your stomach is growling, or maybe you feel a burning in your stomach, or it's a very real, like my stomach is empty. So that's different than what I'm talking about, where there's trauma present and you're just wanting food for some other reason than physiological hunger. So in this practice, if you're feeling something other than physiological hunger, you're going to pause long enough to focus on that. And you're going to focus on it for as long as you can. The first time you do it might only be like 30 seconds. It might only be 5 seconds because you're like, I don't care, give me the food. If you can just pause for an instant and focus on that feeling, then that's going to help you the next time you're feeling that feeling again, that feeling of there's food in the room, brightness, go towards the food, get rid of the food, inhale the food. Whatever feeling you're feeling first, focus on that and sit with it and just keep doing that. That is your practice. What that looked like usually for me when I wanted food, but I wasn't hungry, I wasn't physiologically hungry, it would usually show up as this warmth in my chest, and then it would get bigger and bigger and bigger until my whole body was like, get the food. And then I would eat the food as fast as I can because there was shame there, knowing that I wasn't hungry and knowing that it was kind of weird how attached I was to this food. And then afterwards, I would just kind of feel gross. So my practice was when I would feel that feeling to stop and notice it. And just like I said to you, initially, it would just be like a 5 seconds, okay, I'm noticing this, I'm still gonna eat the food. And then over time, it would get longer and longer and longer. And at some point, it turned into a full-blown meditation practice where I would feel that feeling and I would actually say like, okay, it's time to sit and meditate on this. And then at some point, I was able to ask myself, where did this come from? So the feeling would arise and I would just say, I would talk to it. Hello, where did you come from? What are you trying to show me? And it was that practice that actually was able to point me to memories I had from childhood that revealed to me what it was showing me. And that, my friends, was my path out, my path to releasing that trauma. And now I can happily say that food is no longer the brightest part of my life. It is a bright spot. And there's a whole other host of things that also provide brightness for me. That is the practice that I offer for you. I also invite you, as ever, to give yourself some grace and some love. If this is you, if this is describing you and you know, I've got this weird attachment to food, I know it's connected to trauma, please be kind to yourself. Because how you've responded to the trauma in your life is completely valid, and others respond in a similar way to you. You're not alone in this. No, nor are you abnormal or broken. You are simply a human, and the positive intention of you responding in this way is that you were coping with something. You have successfully coped with something, and now the good news is it's time to up-level your coping mechanism. You don't need this anymore. You've survived the trauma, and it's time to move through it.